The Gospel, Story or Soundbite, Part 5. I only intended this to be a one-off study, but somehow it's grown into 5 episodes. In my first study, I argued that the Gospel, the good news of the kingdom, could never be contained within a soundbite or a sentence or a bumper sticker or a tweet, especially since Jesus gave us a story, actually many stories. And this morning we're going to dig a little bit deeper in another of those stories, one which is notoriously difficult to grasp. We do neither the gospel nor Jesus justice by reducing the good news, the gospel, into saying a sinner's prayer and getting into heaven. A few weeks ago, I quoted a well-known American church leader who managed to reduce the gospel, as he understands it, to 134 characters, less than half the maximum characters permitted in a tweet. He says that the gospel is the news that Jesus Christ died for our sins and rose again, opening the way to eternal joy with God for all who believe. To know that this life is not all that there is good news, indeed, wonderful news, but to believe his definition, I believe, sells the gospel way short of what the good news actually is. The good news is far more than a ticket to heaven. Mark commences his gospel with these words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and then spends 16 chapters declaring what this good news looks like. Matthew takes 28 chapters, Luke 24, and John 21 chapters to unwrap the good news. Last week, we looked at a very unusual, even controversial parable that Jesus told. We wrestled with the parable of the shrewd or streetwise manager who was commended for his dishonest actions by his boss, which has caused many people to suggest that Jesus himself was condoning dishonesty. As we discovered last week, Jesus wasn't doing anything of the sort. The teaching of that parable boiled down to one essential challenge: use your worldly wealth wisely. Use it for the purposes of God's kingdom. Use it in serving others in Christ's name. Use it to feed the poor and educate the illiterate. Use it to support missionaries who will share the message of Christ in places you will never go to. And one day, as Jesus said in the parable, when you get to heaven, you will not only be welcomed by Jesus, but by all those whose lives you help transform through using your worldly wealth wisely. We're then told in verse 14 of Luke chapter 16, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. Well, they could scoff and sneer all they like. Jesus wasn't done yet. They were going to get some more of the same. The story of Lazarus and the rich man, both found in Luke chapter 16. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died and angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was in torment. He looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire. But Abraham replied, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. He answered, Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment? Abraham replied, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. First thing, let us notice that the obvious link between the parable of the shrewd manager and this parable is that both parables start with the words, there was a rich man. I do not believe that's coincidence. When Luke arranged these stories in his gospel, I believe this was deliberate. We're meant to see the link between the two parables. And before we attempt to understand what Jesus was teaching through this parable, let's try to get inside the story. Let's try to understand what's going on here. The story can be divided up into three sections, where we are told, firstly, of two lives, secondly, two destinies, and thirdly, two requests. Firstly, two lives in verses 19 to 21. We're given the contrasting details of two men. First, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen. This is a description of the kind of robes that a high priest wore. Theologian Professor William Barclay says that these robes cost in the region of 1,000 times as much as a labourer's daily wage. 3 years' wages, in other words. The purple dye was obtained from the murex shellfish, and only one drop of this dye could be extracted from each shellfish, which made it so expensive. And only the extremely rich could afford it. In fact, it was called royal or imperial purple. We're also told that he lived in luxury every day, in a country where the ordinary people were fortunate if they ate meat once a week after toiling for 6 days. The man in Jesus' story lived a life of plenty and self-indulgence. Outside his gate laid a beggar whose name was Lazarus. Not the Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead, the brother of Mary and Martha. This Lazarus is just a character in Jesus' story, which in itself is a little unusual, as he's the only person given a name in any of Jesus' parables, which has caused some people to believe that Jesus was actually referring to a real person here, but that's not the case. I believe that the reason he is given a name is to add to the impact of the story. Lazarus means God is my help. And as we shall see, this poor unfortunate guy on earth had help from no one. But as the story unfolds, we see God was his help. We're told that Lazarus was laid at the rich man's gate. He was a crippled man. Others laid him there to beg. Actually, the Greek word that Luke uses was ballo, which when translated means dumped. What does that tell us? It tells us that he wasn't placed carefully, put comfortable for the day, had his pillows plumped. No, he was dumped like a sack of garbage, indicating what others thought of him. Worthless, of no value. We're also told that he was covered in ulcerated sores. He was so helpless that he couldn't even ward off dogs who came to lick his sores. And when you read dogs, please don't think of French poodle called Pixie or Fluffy. What Jesus is talking about are wild dogs, flea-infested, disease-ridden scavengers. And we're also told that he longed to eat what fell from the rich man's table. In those days, people didn't eat with their knives and forks and have napkins. Food was eaten by the hand, and in very wealthy houses, the hands were cleaned not by wet wipes, but by wiping them on slabs of bread, which were then thrown away. This is what Lazarus was waiting for. He, along with the wild dogs, was waiting for the garbage. Secondly, two destinies. Verse 22 and 23. Both men died. We are told that Lazarus, this poor beggar, is transported to glory, We are told that he was carried by angels to Abraham's side, a particularly Jewish way of referring to the place of blessedness beyond the grave, to paradise. Abraham, along with Moses, was the main man for Jewish people. He was the father of the nation of Israel. He was called the father of faith, the friend of God. And Lazarus, this poor and ulcerated beggar, was now in his presence, Abraham's presence, in paradise. This detail would really have upset the scoffing, sneering Pharisees, as they believed that people like Lazarus were cursed by God, and people like the rich man were blessed by God. This same kind of thinking was in the minds of the disciples when they asked Jesus concerning the man who was born blind. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said that neither was true. And that was a common way of looking at things at that time. And sadly, that kind of thinking is still around in some parts of the church, especially with some of our American televangelists preaching their so-called prosperity gospel, where the Cadillac driving multimillionaire is often thought of as being blessed by God, and the sick person, according to their theology, is someone who has done something wrong, either not having enough faith to be healed or having some sin in their lives. Very bad theology indeed. The way that the Pharisees saw life was turned on its head in Jesus' story. Lazarus, the poor beggar, was the one who was carried by angels to Abraham's side, and the rich man is sent to Hades. At this time in Jewish history, Hades was viewed as a place where the dead go to await the final judgment. In the Old Testament, the place is known as Sheol, a dark, shadowy underworld, sometimes referred to as the grave or even death. So Hades is the Greek New Testament word, and the Hebrew Old Testament word is Sheol. Actually, in the time between the Old and the New Testament, which was about 400 years, there was a development in Jewish thinking about Sheol, Hades. It was thought of as having two compartments. That is, one where the righteous went and one where the wicked were put. So this illustration that Jesus uses is something that was well known in Jewish thinking in his day. It's also important to note that we are not meant to gain our understanding of the afterlife from this story. It was just a popular folk tale that Jesus used to get an important message across to the disciples. And what's more, there were 7 other similar versions of this story that circulated in the ancient world. Thirdly, 2 requests, verse 24 through to 31. We are told that the rich man in Hades, and he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham with Lazarus at his side. So he called him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I am in agony in this fire." Notice his first request. He said, "Send Lazarus." He still looked upon Lazarus as inferior to him. It's interesting to note that in his life, the rich man would not have gone within 50 yards of Lazarus downwind. With all his putrefying sores and rotting flesh. But now he asks that Lazarus be sent to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool his tongue. Jesus certainly knows how to tell a story. And ordinary people would have hung on to every word, whilst the religious Pharisees would have been spitting feathers. This story was not only the opposite of what they taught and believed. It appears that Jesus was telling this story against them. Abraham's response in verse 25, "But Abraham replied, 'Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who One to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. Here we find the complete reversal of what went on during their time on earth. During his earthly life, the rich man chose not to go to suffering Lazarus at his gate. In the afterlife, Lazarus could not go to the suffering rich man in Hades. Then the rich man, in desperation, makes a second request, asking that Lazarus be sent to his 5 brothers to warn them to mend their ways. Although the rich man had no desire to help beggar Lazarus, it seems that he has some pity towards his own flesh and blood. But again, his request is refused. As Abraham says, if they have not listened to Moses and the prophets, they won't listen to anyone coming back from the dead. We'll come back to that in a moment. I heard an amusing story of something that happened in a small Christian Midwestern college in the USA. The college invited some of its final year students to be used on college publicity to promote the college to prospective students. A few students were asked to provide a photograph, what they majored in, their expectation for the future, and a life verse. Well, one very disgruntled student put down his life verse as Luke 16:27 and 28. I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for they have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment. The magazine editor didn't catch it, neither did the faculty advisor, and it got printed, much to the anger of the faculty. Great story. So what does this parable mean? What are the legitimate lessons that we can take from it? What was Jesus meaning to teach by telling this story? Well, the usual evangelical interpretation goes something like this. This parable teaches that we need to make sure that we turn to Christ during our time on earth, as it will be too late after we die, for there is no opportunity for repentance afterwards, as there is this unbridgeable chasm between heaven and hell. And I've heard that preached on in that particular way on a number of occasions. Well, let me give you some reasons why I don't believe that that is the lesson from this parable. Firstly, nowhere does this parable say that Lazarus was virtuous and holy, let alone being a Christian. And yet he gets into paradise. For all we know, Lazarus might have spent his entire life disobeying the commands of God. The only thing that we know for sure about Lazarus, he was poor. Similarly with the rich man, he's not spoken of as being a wicked man. He's not referred to as being antagonistic to the Christian faith or as being an unbeliever. The only thing that we are told about this rich man is that he was rich. Nothing less, nothing more. I suppose there is an inference that he could have done something more than he did to help Lazarus at his gate. But we're not explicitly told this. So we can't claim that this parable is about Lazarus being a Christian and the rich man being an unbeliever. That's really to mess around with the facts of the story that Jesus told. Yet, that is the way that it is so often interpreted by many Christians. And furthermore, if this parable was a picture of what the afterlife looks like, then are we also to believe that communication is possible between the two places? That is, someone who is in heaven can look into hell and view their suffering, and vice versa. Someone in hell can look up and see the saints enjoying themselves in heaven. If there was such a window between heaven and hell, that those in heaven could look through and see the torment of those in the other place, then it wouldn't be such a joyous place. It wouldn't be heaven. To tell you the truth, I wouldn't think much of God's architectural design. There's one more thing. If this parable is supposed to represent what happens immediately after death, then why are Lazarus and the rich man depicted as having physical bodies? For most Christians believe that following death, the soul goes on to be with the Lord, and the physical body goes back to the earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, which are the words that I've declared in hundreds of funerals. One day we will all receive new bodies, but that is not yet. The resurrection body will happen when Christ returns and we have the judgment. I hope that I've not confused you, but what I'm saying here is that for those reasons, I cannot believe that we are being taught something of the afterlife. I really don't believe that we are. All I'm saying is that this is not what the parable is about. So what is this parable teaching us then? What's the context? As we've said many times before, take the text out of context and all you're left with is a con. The first parable in Luke 16, the manager, the shrewd manager, it's all about the need to use our worldly wealth wisely. And Jesus offers us an attractive opportunity to make friends for ourselves with our wealth so that they will welcome us into heaven one day. The parable is followed by Luke telling us that the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus, which is followed then by the second parable, which, as I mentioned earlier, starts with the same words as the first parable. There was a rich man. If nothing else, it should at least alert us to the possibility that there is a continued theme here. The focus of the first story is on the use or the misuse of worldly wealth. And that, I believe, is exactly the same subject in Jesus' story about Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man did not use his worldly wealth when he had the opportunity. He was selfish, he was self-indulgent, and his sin was that he did not notice Lazarus. He just accepted him as part of the landscape. He didn't feel pity or grief. And if he did nothing about it. His sin was the sin of omission. He did nothing. The power of this parable lies in the emotional impact that it has upon you. For example, if I asked you what constitutes a good joke, I suppose the answer to that question is that which makes you laugh. You don't need to think too hard about it. It touches something deep inside and causes an automatic response. If you try to dissect a joke and break it down into its constituent parts and analyze why something might or might not be funny, then its power is gone. I've needed to work hard to explain the points of reference, but when the disciples heard this story for the first time, they got it. They felt its power. Jesus didn't need to explain it to them. The rich man didn't care for the poor man at his gate and got what he deserved. He got his just deserts. And the rich man then tries to save his 5 living brothers from the same fate by requesting that Lazarus be sent to them. Surely they would sort out their lives if someone came back from the dead. And Abraham says no. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they would not listen to someone who rises from the dead. What did he mean? Well, Moses and the prophets was another way of speaking of the Old Testament scriptures. There's quite some irony in these words as well, in that the time when Luke wrote his gospel, Jesus had risen from the dead and had given many proofs that he was alive, yet many of the religious leaders still refused to believe. The story tells us that the rich man and his 5 siblings had God's instructions already. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord is giving to you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Isaiah 58. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. And then Micah chapter 6 verse 8. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. One commentator says, if they can be inhuman with the Bible in their hands and Lazarus at their gate, no revelation of the splendors of heaven or the anguish of hell will ever make them anything else. 2,000 years on, that challenge remains for us too. We have a Bible in our hands, and through the world's media, we have Lazarus at our gate, actually Lazarus in our living rooms. Our worldly wealth can take the gospel where we might not be able to go. It can feed the hungry and educate the unschooled and cause the Lord's kingdom to come and his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. If we have food to eat every day, own a pair of shoes, have a roof over our heads, we are rich in comparison to most of the world's population. If we own a car or even a bicycle, then we are very rich in comparison to the rest of the world. Western Europe is one of the wealthiest parts of the world, and we have no more excuses than the rich man in this story. So some questions. Who is our Lazarus? Who is the beggar at our gate? Do we have eyes to see what is happening in our world, in our town, in our community, in our street? Do we walk through life never wanting to get our hands dirty? Do we have compassion on the lost, the least and the lonely in society? Well, Tamworth Elim Church, over the years, most of you have embraced this message. You have reached out with compassion in so many ways, and you continue to do so. You have such big hearts for the poor, for the disenfranchised, for the vulnerable, for the orphan, for the widow. Thank you, and well done. But let us keep challenging ourselves and make sure that we don't ever get complacent or overfamiliar. Pray that we might see others just as Jesus sees them. For what does the Lord require of us, the church? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And I suppose my prayer would be, taken from the words of an old song, soften our hearts, Lord, soften our hearts. From all indifference set us apart, to feel your compassion, to weep with your tears. Soften our hearts, Lord, soften our hearts. God bless. Do have a great week.